Our next award is the Gold Medal for Distinguished Journalism. I am pleased to call up past President Michael Ferrara to present the award to this year's recipient, Wendell Potter.
Joel and Diane. Thank you. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce you to Wendell Potter. Wendell is my hero because he decided to leave corporate America, where he was a big wheel at Cigna, and instead of doing the corporate bidding, he decided to do the good fight that we all do, to fight for the consumers, for the little guy. You're going to hear a little bit about that in the time constraints that we have tonight. But there are certain books that I would like you to take a look at. He's written a book called Deadly Spin. He's written 2 other books dealing with Obamacare. He's one of the leading health insurance experts in the country because of the 20 years that he spent at Cigna doing that stuff. His background is fascinating. He grew up in Tennessee, and he went to the University of Tennessee, who until recently were #1 in the country. And he began work as an investigative journalist, eventually for the Scripps Howard newspaper chain. He covered Congress. He covered local politics in Tennessee. And then he got this chance to move to Cigna, and he worked his way up where he became the top person in the field of PR and corporate communications. He's flying around the country in his private jet, and one day he went back to Tennessee to visit his family, and he saw a sign that said there's a health care clinic being held down the road here. And because it was his business, he followed the sign and went down these rural back roads in Appalachia until he came across this gigantic barn in the pouring rain where there were lines of people waiting to get health care, and people being examined in horses' stalls virtually. And that was when Wendell had his epiphany that he would give up the corporate jet and the corporate existence and do something to fix health care in the United States. And that's what he's done now for years. Wendell will also tell you about the Tarbell organization. Anybody here know who Ida Tarbell is? Ida Tarbell was one of the first investigative journalists in history in the early 1900s. She's the reporter, the investigative journalist who broke the story into the corruption that was the Standard Oil monopoly. And when Standard Oil got broken up, into Exxon and Esso and Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of Indiana and all that stuff, you remember? This was Ida that did all that. So Wendell's mission now, and he's going to tell you more about it, deals with this Ida Tarbell, and he took her name, and it's now called the Tarbell Foundation, and on your seats you have a little thing talking about Tarbell and where you can find more about it. At this time, please welcome Wendell Potter to receive our award for journalism. This is the award, which is not the gold medal. Here's the gold medal, and it's not really gold, but during dinner, we're going to have Wendell actually take it out of this and put it around his neck, you know, like they do in the Olympics. Wendell,
Thanks
thank
so
you.
much, Mike.
Okay.
Mike, thank you so much, and thank you all. I'm so honored by this award. As Mike said, I've actually had 2 journalism careers separated by many years as a corporate executive. I never set out when I was in journalism school. It never occurred to me that I would have a career in the insurance business. But PR people make more money than journalists do, and they still do. And I was kind of enticed away from journalism, wound up working first for Humana for 4 years in Louisville, Kentucky, and then I was recruited by Cigna and had a career of more than 15 years at Cigna Corporation, first in Connecticut and then Philadelphia. And I might still be doing the work that I did back then had I not made that trip back home to visit family in Tennessee and happened upon this outdoor clinic that Mike referenced. That epiphany that Mike mentioned was one also that made me realize that what I was doing for a living was in many ways the exact opposite of what I tried to do as a journalist. I always tried to be honest and objective, fair in my reporting, never to knowingly mislead people. But it occurred to me when I saw that scene in Wise County, Virginia, actually, a few miles across the state line, that I had to be partly responsible for that scene because of the work that I did to mislead Americans, to mislead policymakers. I spent a lot of time in Washington working with my peers to help create propaganda campaigns to push back against any kind of reform that might have a detrimental effect on profits and profit margins. I was even working with my colleagues, my peers, in the early years of the Clinton administration and helped to create the PR campaign and the lobbying campaign that was so successful that it defeated the Clintons' efforts to reform the healthcare system. And I did that kind of work for a number of years. But when I made that trip back to the Appalachian Mountains and seeing those people in those long lines waiting for care in barns and animal stalls, waiting in those long lines in the rain, I knew that I had to take some responsibility for that. And I knew, again, that what I was doing for a living was so far away from what I had been trained to do as a journalist. And I realized, too, that I could have been one of those people had I not been lucky enough to get a good education, get a good job, and have a career in journalism and then public relations. So I made a commitment that day that I would find some other way to earn a living. But it took some months, and I might even still have been working at Cigna had I not gotten a phone call a few months later from a reporter in Los Angeles who asked, actually my assistant, why Cigna had refused to pay for a liver transplant for a 17-year-old girl in Los Angeles. She was enrolled in a Cigna plan through her father's employer, Mercedes-Benz. She needed a liver transplant, and one was scheduled. A liver had been found. It's a perfect match. Her family just assumed it would happen. They came to the hospital, UCLA Medical Center, in early December of 2007, expecting that they would be waiting during the surgery. But instead, they were taken aside by one of the physicians who said, "I'm sorry we can't go forward with this because we haven't got clearance from Cigna." I got to know the family later, and Mrs. Sarkeesian told me that she said, what do you mean? What does Cigna have to do with this? We know that transplants are a covered benefit. What does Cigna have to do with it? And the surgeon said, well, I'm sorry, but a medical director for Cigna has looked at what we sent them and said he does not think that it's medically appropriate for Natalie, their 17-year-old girl. They appealed that denial pretty quickly, but the denial was not approved. I mean, the appeal was not approved. denial was upheld. The family was desperate and determined to see what they could do to move forward with the surgery. They decided to try to mount a media campaign to shame Cigna, and some friends of theirs, including the California Nurses Association, which the family had some connections with, they began to mobilize, and they reached out to the media in Los Angeles and in other parts of the state. And that's what resulted in that phone call. Their work resulted in one TV reporter from LA calling me and asking why Natalie had not gotten that transplant. They said they had heard that maybe Cigna had believed that the family was well off and that they could afford the transplant. That didn't make any sense to me. But I thought I could just make the story go away with our typical statement of, we try, the pablum that we try to make sure that everyone who's enrolled in our health plan gets access to the care that they need. Over the years, I'd handled so many of what we referred to as high-profile stories. We also call them horror stories because they truly were, in many cases, stories of horror in which an insurance company, for one reason or another, had denied coverage for someone who was entitled to it. I, again, thought I could just make the story go away, but I began getting other phone calls from reporters around Los Angeles and then from other places in California. So I knew that we had something going on that was not typical at all. And this did have the makings for a PR nightmare for Cigna if we didn't do something about it pretty quickly. I told the CEO what was going on and others in the executive suite, and eventually when the family decided to have a protest in front of Cigna's regional offices in Glendale, California, that's when the executive management team decided, well, maybe this is something we need to take another look at, because CNN had called me and said they were planning to cover it live. I had a TV in my office, and I was able to actually watch what was going on as the family assembled in front of our Glendale offices. But I, just a few minutes earlier, had been able to convince the CEO and others that, look, this is something that really could be very, very damaging to the reputation of this company if we don't do something very quickly. And the CEO and the president of Cigna Healthcare decided, after consulting with a few folks in medical management, that in this case, the company would make an exception, that the company would agree to pay for this. But as you could imagine, the company wanted me to write a statement that would make sure that it was not seen as a precedent, that this was not something that we were doing that would set any kind of legal precedent, but we were doing this because of pretty much out of the goodness of our hearts. But that was good enough for me. I thought, well, maybe this will be a way of making sure that Natalie gets that transplant. One of my responsibilities was making sure that the family, which actually was in front of our building in Glendale, the TV cameras were rolling. They were filming this. I was watching it on TV, and I had to get word to Glendale through one of our lawyers, actually, to go down and tell the family that Cigna had reversed that denial, that Cigna would pay for the transplant. And I felt pretty good about what I had done. I thought I had done something that might save this young girl's life. I could watch on TV, live TV, as I saw someone whisper into Mrs. Sarkeesian's ear that Cigna had reversed that denial. She was going to get the transplant. She was hugging people around her, and then people were cheering. And I went home that evening thinking that things would work out well for Natalie and that family. But 5 hours later, I got a phone call that Natalie had passed away. During that time between when the doctors had requested approval for the transplant and the time that it actually was approved, days had passed. Natalie had gotten sicker. Some of her other organs began to shut down, and she died. And the liver, by the way, that had been made available obviously earlier, had to be given to someone else. And that was what did it for me. I could not, in good conscience, keep doing what I was doing, which was in many cases to mislead the American public about our healthcare system. It was my job to help people, or to try to convince people that we have the best healthcare system in the world, and we did a darn good job. So many people still believe that's the case. Much of what I did, I'm sorry to say, was truly mislead people. And it's going on yet again. I was in Washington just yesterday. I was asked by a congresswoman to speak at the introduction, a press conference around the introduction of a bill that would create what they refer to as a Medicare for All type healthcare system, which would essentially sideline the private insurance business from the delivery or financing of our healthcare system. And I was grateful for that opportunity to do that. But the insurance industry is bound and determined to try to keep anything from happening that would disrupt the status quo and do anything that might hinder profits. Although you might note that yesterday, just as a consequence of that press conference, the stocks of all the major insurance companies took a big hit just from the introduction of that one bill. As I said earlier, as Mike noted, I've come kind of full circle around to come back to journalism. One of the things that I realized toward the end of my career was that we were seeing a diminishment of investigative reporting. When I first began my career at Cigna, I would get calls often from reporters who were interested in truly covering and getting to know how our company really operated. And going beyond the numbers. At the end of my time, I left in May of 2008. About the only calls I was getting at that time, I handled financial communications for the company, by the way. I had to know how my company made money and what we did with that money. About the only reporters who were calling were reporters with the Wall Street Journal and Reuters and Dow Jones and Bloomberg, and their stories were written by journalists for the investment community, not for regular folks. So I decided I had to do something about it. Over the course of the past several years, we've seen so many newsrooms decimated with layoffs. The old business model for journalism just doesn't work anymore. Advertising revenue at newspapers has dried up. There's very little investigative reporting anywhere, certainly at newspapers, absolutely at broadcast affiliates. You just don't see the kind of reporting that we really need. So I decided to do something that never would have occurred to me. That is to start my own journalism organization. And as Mike mentioned, we're named after Ida Tarbell. We didn't start with a lot of money in the bank by any means. We don't have a rich benefactor. We decided to do something pretty unique. We started with a crowdfunding campaign. This was in November of 2017 when we launched that crowdfunding campaign. I think it was October of 2017. We raised a considerable sum of money. We got contributors from every single state in this country, and they are members of Tarbell. Some of them give kind of the equivalent of a contribution to a Bernie Sanders campaign of like $27 a month, or $7 actually a month, to support our journalism. We survive on the support of those who are our supporters, our contributors. We have been fortunate to build a track record of good reporting, so we now have received funding from some very prominent foundations in this country. A lot of family foundations have contributed to our reporting. What we do at Tarbell is the kind of work that Ida Tarbell did 100 years ago. It's look at how big corporations really operate. And we focus on the intersection of corporations or big business and politics and public policy. We help people understand how corporations like the ones that I used to work for are able to spend money to get what they want, to maintain a very profitable status quo, while the rest of us in one way or another are paying the consequences. And they certainly are in healthcare. Some of our reporting, our initial reporting is focused on the pharmaceutical industry. We're focusing on why drugs are so expensive in this country, why healthcare in general is so expensive. We pay, as you may know, twice as much per capita on health care, almost $10,000 a person in this country, which is twice as much as the average of other developed countries in the world. And the reason we do is because of the grip that the special interests in health care have over our politicians, not just in Washington, but the state level and even the city and municipal level. So what we do is help people understand how that all happens. And I know how it happens because I used to be a part of it. And we walk people through this. We help connect the dots so that people can understand how they are affected every single day by the corruption that we find in Washington and elsewhere. The name of that last book I wrote, by the way, is Nation on the Take, How Big Money Corrupts Our Democracy and What We Can Do About It. I encourage you to check out Tarbell. Tarbell.org is our website. We take no advertising. We do not want to be influenced, and we aren't influenced by any advertisers or anyone. We don't accept corporate gifts. We rely solely on those who read us and support what we're trying to do. And I hope that you will be among them. Take a look at what we're doing, and also what I want you to do is let me know if you have any cases you're working on, anything that you think that our journalism could help to achieve what you're trying to achieve, please let us know. The nonprofit organization, by the way, that I founded to publish Tarbell is called To Be Fair, Inc. And our mission is to help achieve a more just and fair and civil society through journalism. So please check us out. We welcome whistleblowers. I've been called a whistleblower because of what I did. My first time out as a critic of my industry was before Congress in 2009. Soon after that, by the way, my first speech was made in California at the Civil Justice Foundation. This was in 2009, and it was the very first speech that I made about what I do for a living now. So please do check us out. I'm so honored to get this award and grateful for what you all do. And if I can help support what you're doing through journalism, please reach out to us. Thank you very much.